Hello and welcome back to the kitchen. This is Jake with Golden Fox Farms, and today we're going to look at making creamed honey. It's a nasty day outside, so it's a great day to stay inside. And a lot of beekeepers don't realize this is actually a very achievable little home project. So let's talk about what it is and how it works. As you likely already know, honey can granulate. Some honeys are slower to granulate than others. This honey here is nice and liquid still. Some honeys are rather fast to granulate. And when we have honey granulate, it can often granulate in ways that aren't pleasing to the palate. Like this has some rather large crystals in it and really doesn't feel good on the tongue, though it works fine for baking or for adding to your tea or whatever. The trick, if you have honey that wants to granulate, is to actually just go ahead and cream it. Now, creamed honey is actually an intentionally granulated honey, and it has a much finer texture. You can't feel any grit in this on your tongue. So this is actually a really popular product. If you look at honey sales in Europe, creamed honey actually far and away is more common than liquid honey is. And if you're using this to add to a sandwich or put on a muffin or whatever, this kind of parks. It's a spread effectively. So how do we make this? The way we make this is we can take a honey that already wants to crystallize, melt all the crystals by holding it at a high enough temperature to melt it, and then intentionally crystallizing it by adding a source with a known crystal quality and then chilling it down to 55 degrees. Now, how do we get a rough crystal honey to go back to liquid form? The most common way is by heating. As you all saw in my video involving drying honey, I have this great big bucket of honey. And this crystallized in my basement all on its own. But it crystalled with a really kind of funky crystal structure. It wasn't very pleasant. So what I did is I heated this and held it at 104 degrees for a couple days, and that was enough to knock crystals out. Now, if you heat above 105, that's the temperature where the enzymes start to decompose. Now realize you can take it to like 115 and the enzymes are starting to be lost, but they don't all just disappear the second you go over 105 degrees. There's a time curve that we need to take into consideration. Like you can hold stuff at 115 degrees for several days before you'd actually start to significantly reduce those enzyme levels. So if you have to heat above 105, you can just make it as short of a period as you can and use as low a temperature as you can to reduce denaturing your product. And at that point, it's no longer a raw product. So anyway, we convert this to a liquid, and then we take the liquid and we add creamed honey to it. This is the Dyce method that came out of Cornell in the 1930s. A lot of people are like, well, where can I find a source for crystal honey? That's a lot of creamed honey. Well, you make it. Quite literally, you make it. I'll use this to convert this whole bucket to creamed honey. And I made this by taking some of the honey out of here and adding a decent seed stock. In this case, I actually got the idea to use this from one of my commercial beekeeper friends. It actually makes a very nice light creamed honey. Some creamed honeys have a tighter texture. They're almost cheese-like. This one's very spreadable still, and that's my preference. So let's make a batch of it. So how are we going to make this happen? The first step is to get 9 parts honey in here and 1 part creamed honey in there, because this is going to be our mixing bowl. So let's bring that over here, take the lid off of our honey bucket, and we'll just ladle over 12 ladles worth, or 9 ladles worth rather. It's an imperfect process. Don't be too worried if you don't get it exactly. Now, a word of warning about this process. You do need to have the honey cooled back down. If you heat the honey to get crystals out of it, it's going to be too hot to put crystal stock into it. You'll just melt those crystals. So you want to let the honey cool to room temperature or whatever temperature is convenient for you to work with it before adding your seed stock. All right, that's 9. Probably a half gallon or so in there. And then we're going to want to take a ladle of this stuff and park it in there. Now, rather than using this one that's got all this liquid honey on it, I'm going to use a second scoop. That should be good. Mess with that later. So now we can take our mixer bowl and load it in our stand mixer. Locked, and we'll just let that work. And once it's fully integrated, we can then transfer that to a vessel to let it actually set inside of. We want to let this run until it is uniform in color and fully mixed. By having that seed stock distributed in that honey, when we chill this honey, which is the next step after packaging, it helps it all cure with that same texture. All right, that looks pretty mixed, so let's go ahead and shut it off. Pull that out. Let it drip off for the most part. Now what I'm going to do from here is I have these handy little 12-ounce creamed honey tubs, and I'll put this product straight into this tub. How do I know it's 12 ounces? Because that's what the label says. Now, if you haven't figured it out already, this can be a very messy process, so just be aware. And I'll go just a little high because this isn't a proper scale, and I'm just going to end up selling this at a farmer's market, so if I sell a little extra in the tub, I'm not too worried about it. So we'll cap this and come back and see what it looks like in about 3 days after being held at 55 degrees. And I don't know if it was apparent, that's the fill line on these things, that little rim. So now this cream honey does have a lot of air in it. That air will come out as it sits, and we'll have a look at that and what it does later. That's probably right there. So the key things for doing this process is start with honey without crystals, so you have to decrystallize first, and then you add seed stock, which is the pre-creamed honey, at 10%. Then you store at 55 degrees Fahrenheit until it sets. Dyce says 3 days. I say it takes longer, but that's just my experience. So why do we want to start with a honey that's not crystallized? When honey crystallizes naturally, it tends to have odd sizes of crystals and odd shapes of crystals. And what this will do is it creates a funky mouthfeel, or might cause a grittiness that is unpleasant. So we don't want this. And what we want is that perfectly clear honey, and we want a seed stock that has a very uniform, very small crystal. And the reason why you want it uniform and small is when we add this to our big thing of liquid honey, these crystals have a tendency to seed other crystals of the same size. So, if we take this nice refined creamed honey and add it to there, this, when it's kept at 55 degrees, will crystallize with a similar structure and texture. So let's see what ours actually turned out like. I have two different jars here. One is the batch we did 3 days ago, and one is a batch that's got about 10 days on it. And they're very different to me, visually speaking. This one is still very much curing. It's only been in there for 3 days, and you can see it's somewhat liquid still. This needs more time. The Dyce method says 3 days at 55 will do it. Remember, the honey has to cool down from whatever temperature you have it at to get to that 55 degrees first, so it's not instantaneous. And given another week, this will probably look just like this one. This is much, much harder. I mean, you can see how little it's moving. It still has some liquidity to it, but I prefer cream honey that has a soft enough texture to work on the bread and sandwiches, because if I find that the more cheese textured ones, the harder ones, are actually often too hard for the baked good to survive its application. And you can kind of see the texture we have in here, how fine that crystal structure is. So this plays really well with baked goods and everything else. This one on the left, being it's still setting up, is just a lot looser. But in time, held at the right temperature, with those crystals seeded all throughout it, it will mimic the one on the right perfectly. They'll be very similar. Now the question will always come up, why didn't I just mix it in a bucket instead of a stand mixer? And you can mix creamed honey in a bucket. You can. You just have to be careful that you don't get plastic filings into it. And that's the issue I ran into. When I would make 101 sugar water using a bucket mixer, I'd always get some amount of plastic peeled off of the bucket walls, so I avoided doing that. So with this, I hope we've shown you how to easily make creamed honey at home. And with that, I hope you're prepared to take on the honey creaming adventure. And I'll say good luck and happy beaking.